Also today's chair. So today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Llew Mills, good friend of NDARC. Llew is a researcher who specialises in clinical addiction research, and he's based at the Langton Centre, which is part of the South East Sydney LHD Drug and Alcohol Service. He also has an honorary appointment at the University of Sydney in the the Specialty School of Addiction Medicine. Today, Llew is going to be talking to us about a really interesting topic. He's going to be presenting findings from the biennial Cannabis As Medicine Survey. So I'm sure we'll have lots to discuss. So after Llew has presented, he's asked for Rhys Cohen to join us on a panel discussion. Now, Rhys is a drug policy expert with a background in political economy and a focus on medicinal and adult use cannabis. Rhys has worked as a consultant, an analyst, a communicator for corporate, academic and non-government organisations in the cannabis sector since about 2016. He's also currently a policy officer at the Pennington Institute and sits on the non-executive advisory board of the Lambert Institute for Cannabinoid Therapeutics at the University of Sydney. According to Llew, if there is something about cannabis that Rhys doesn't know, it's not worth knowing. So we will also be joined on the panel by Professor Michael Farrell, who, as many of you will know, is a bit of an expert in most things to do with drug and alcohol. So it should be a great discussion. We will be taking questions after the presentation. So please put any questions you have in the Q&A function. Please frame your questions as best as you can to help us get through as many as we can in that short time. So I'm going to get out of the way, but before I do, I'd just like to take a moment to pay my respects and to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we're all meeting from, in which case, for me, it is the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I would also like to show my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and to make a particular warm welcome to any First Nations people joining us today. Okay, I'm delighted to begin this webinar. I'm going to get out of your way and invite Llew to please turn on your camera and mic. We can see your slides there, Llew, so it looks like you're ready to go. Hope you've got your cups of tea and your chocolate biscuits ready. Looks good, Llew. I'm going to hand over to you. Off you go.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for having me along, NDARC and Sarah. So today I'm going to talk about some ongoing work that we've been doing over here with the Lambert initiative and with Nick, my boss, who you all know. Okay, this is not working. There we are. Okay, so this is the CAMS team. Well, a lot of you would know Dave Alsop. Dave's no longer with us, sadly, but he was one of the creators of the Cannabis As Medicine Surveys way back in 2016. And he's much loved and missed. And this is Nick, my boss, Nick Linceris, who you all know. This is Ian McGregor, who's the director of the Lambert Initiative. Jonathan Arnold, Anastasia Surev, Tom Arkell, Sarah Abelev, and Silla Zhu. So before therapeutic goods can be legally supplied, imported, or exported into Australia, they must be included in the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. Now, products not included in the ARTG are referred to as unapproved therapeutic goods. Since 1989, with the Therapeutic Goods Act, if conditions are met, medical practitioners can prescribe unapproved therapeutic goods not on the ARG. Under the Special Access Scheme, where a doctor applies on behalf of an individual patient, and the Authorised Prescriber Scheme, where a doctor obtains a licence and they can then prescribe to multiple patients. So prior to November 2016, Australians could be prescribed cannabis products for medicinal purposes, but these had to be imported specially, which was a very difficult process. In 2016, the Narcotic Drugs Amendment Act allowed Australian manufacturers to produce medical cannabis and made it much easier to get access to medical cannabis. So the Cannabis As Medicine surveys were created by Dave, Ian and Nick to create the changing profiles and experiences of medical cannabis users post-legalisation. They were biennial surveys starting in 2016, just after the Act was promulgated, and there's been one ever since. We haven't done one for 2024 yet, though, which has obviously passed, so we'll see what happens. We're going to look at what has changed across the surveys today. And what's changed in the medical cannabis landscape. So the aim of the surveys is to examine consumer experiences medical cannabis use over time. The surveys are online, anonymous, and confidential, which allows people to disclose illicit activity. It's eligible to Australian residents who had used cannabis for medical reasons in the past year, aged over 18 or 18 or over. Recruitment was mainly through online media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, but also medical cannabis consumer groups, the Lambert Initiative website, and in cannabis clinics. We've done 3 main papers from this survey, although a lot of secondary papers. In the first survey, we got 1,700 participants, 1,400 in CAMS 18, 1,600 in CAMS 20, and a whopping 4,500 in CAMS 22, thanks largely to Scylla. Go Scylla. I hope she's there. I know she works at NDARC now. This is just a slide showing the sources of recruitment for the different surveys. As you can see, it sort of jumps around a lot depending on how the rules for advertising change, particularly at Facebook. And the only reason I really show this is because it causes problems for inference, because it confounds change in our sample with change over time. And because of that, I have to corroborate findings with outside sources when I'm trying to decide whether one is due to actual change over time or just the fact that we're sampling a different population. Now, this is really the marquee finding, and it has a lot of downstream effects for the other stuff we're going to discuss. But the main thing you can see over here on the left is that the number of people who said that they had obtained a prescription for cannabis has increased dramatically over the course of the 4 surveys that I'm discussing. Less than 1% in CAMS 2016, unsurprisingly, given that it had only just become legal. And then we've got about 2% in CAMS 18, that leapt up dramatically to 37% in CAMS 20, and then a whopping about 3/4 of people who did the surveys of respondents had actually been prescribed cannabis by the time we got to 2022. So that's a remarkable increase. And this is reflected in the TGA SASB approvals. You can see now we're up to around, last year there were 180,000 SASB approvals. And we're like halfway through 2025, we're already up around 80K. So there's been massive growth. So this is a table. I really hate tables, so I'm going to make it easy for everyone. Basically, there were virtually no people prescribed cannabis in CAMS 16, so they tended to have a greater resemblance to non-medical users. They were younger, they had a longer history of cannabis use for both medical and non-medical reasons, and they used more non-medical cannabis. Nick doesn't like me using the word recreational, but I think a lot of people understand that. I may lapse into the word recreational, so please forgive me, Nick. But over time, as more and more people entered the prescribed medical cannabis space, the age and the age participants first used cannabis started to increase, suggesting that perhaps more cannabis naive people were starting to access medical cannabis for their health conditions. Backing this idea up, the proportion of respondents who had never used for non-medical reasons and the proportion of total use for medical reasons have both increased over time. Cost is rising again, but this doesn't make much sense with illicit and prescribed cannabis lumped together. So this is a graph showing the main route of administration, the way people consume their medical cannabis. And you can see that over time, prescribed use has increased. The proportion who as prescribed use has increased, the proportion who mainly smoke their cannabis has decreased with a concomitant increase in the use of vaporizers and edibles. So people are using it more safely. There's been, people are getting more comfortable discussing their medical cannabis use with their doctors, which I think is a good thing. More say that accessing medical cannabis is easy, though these numbers are still very low, below 20%. The proportion who say their medical practitioner is unwilling or unqualified to prescribe is dropping. However, cost still remains a barrier. People still don't like how much it costs. Now, this is probably what's going to be the main topic for the rest of the talk. This is the medical conditions that people treat with medical cannabis. And this was a question where we asked people, what is the main reason that you use medical cannabis? For what condition? Pain and mental health are the most common conditions by a mile. and have been since the beginning in 2016, with sleep a distant third. Now, the proportion who are saying that a mental health condition was their main reason for using medical cannabis has dropped from CAMS 16 to CAMS 20. You can see that drop there. And with a concomitant increase in the proportion who said pain was their main reason. However, what happened between CAMS 20 and CAMS 22 is that the proportion who said that mental health was their main reason leapt back up again with a concomitant drop in pain. So just in summary, what's changed over the CAMS surveys? Well, the proportion of CAMS respondents who are accessing medical cannabis legally has increased dramatically from less than 1% in 2016 to about 75% in CAMS 22. The average age respondents first use cannabis for any reason has risen, as has the proportion who had never used cannabis before using it medicinally. Respondents are smoking less, they're using oral forms more, and discussing their use with healthcare providers more. We observed little change. I haven't shown this data, but the little change was observed across the surveys in their ratings of effectiveness or side effects. And as I showed, cost is still a barrier to many people accessing prescribed medical cannabis. It's still cheaper to get it from a dealer. So what's changed over the CAMS surveys? From CAMS 16 to CAMS 20, the proportion of respondents who mainly use medical cannabis to treat a pain condition was rising across the surveys and treating anxiety decreasing. But that appears to be reversing again, with prescriptions for mental health increasing from CAMS 20 to CAMS 22. However, as I mentioned, CAMS is a convenient sample, so there's self-selection. And so the changes could be due to a different makeup of a cohort, that's fewer Twitter and more Facebook, rather than evidence of any real trend. And so how do we know? Well, we look outside. This is a paper by Sarah McPhail, who's over at the Lambert Initiative. And what she's noticed is that she looked at some TGA data, and that she noted that there's been a notable trend for younger males and females gaining approval for flower products, that's smoking, for indications within the mental and behavioural disorders group. And this has also been noticed by our panellist today, Reese Cohen. This was also evident in correspondent analysis that highlighted the distinct patient subgroup and a shift towards S8 products in the treatment of anxiety. So other people are noting this increase in prescriptions for anxiety, an increase of use of medical cannabis for anxiety. And this is Reese's co-author, Martin Lane, who also says medicinal cannabis has been prescribed for more than 140 conditions. Prior to 2020, people aged 45 to 52 were the largest group of patients, whereas after 2020, 20 to 31-year-olds were the predominant group. So we'll have a look at that. This is I think this is from another Cannabis article. I'm not sure whether Reese wrote this or not. But it was noted that patients are getting younger, maler, and more anxious. That is, they're getting more prescriptions for the stated reason of anxiety, and their preference is for flower, which is smoked cannabis. So based on that age comment, I broke apart the age data, and it looks like to me here, if you look over at the 18 to 30 group, we see that reducing from CAMS 16 to CAMS 20 and then increasing again in CAMS 22. So to me, it looks like the relatively youthful cohort of illicit medical cannabis users in CAMS 16 is being diluted as older people started getting prescriptions. So that's this trend down here. But between 2020 and 2022, younger people seem to embracing prescribed medical cannabis, and you see that proportion shoot back up again. And unfortunately, there weren't enough respondents in CAMS 20 who are using prescribed medical cannabis to be able to assess any change from the two. But we can look at special access scheme data, which collects age and condition prescribed information. So this is a bit of a confusing graph, even for me now, after having presented it a few times. But over on the left, top left, you can see that prescriptions for all conditions have increased enormously, especially between 2019 and 2021. And between 2019 and 2020, prescriptions for insomnia, this graph down here on the bottom right shows change from year-on-year change, basically. I left out 2018 to 2019 because we had about a 3,000 increase, and that just reflects the fact that it went from 0 to a little bit above 0. But prescriptions for insomnia went up over 500% between 2019 and 2020. Anxiety went up 300%, prescriptions for anxiety, and just under 300% between 2020 and 2021. And you compare this with about an increase of about 100% for chronic pain and for prescriptions generally. And this flattens out around 2022, around here, but approvals generally are still staying high, which is why you've got to look at raw numbers per year as well as change to work out what's happening here. And if you break it down by age, once again, 2019 to 2020 saw the largest increase in approvals. Growth in approvals for anxiety was high among all age groups, but was highest among younger patients. And the increasing anxiety approvals is much larger than in pain approvals across all age groups. If you compare these numbers here, these change numbers here to the change numbers here. So why this dramatic increase in anxiety prescriptions? One hypothesis could be that there's been a dramatic increase in the incidence of anxiety disorders among younger adults and all adults generally. However, this seems quite unlikely. Another explanation is that there's a hidden population of anxiety sufferers who have become aware that they can obtain medical cannabis on prescription for their condition and thus are no longer hidden. And when I say hidden, I mean they were using illicitly obtained medical cannabis to treat their anxiety. This seems more likely, and it's concerning because, for one, there's little empirical evidence from well-designed clinical trials indicating any efficacy for mental health or sleep conditions. I'd be happy to be contradicted on this, but I haven't seen any evidence yet. And it's also concerning because there appears to be a culture now developing among prescribers where it's considered normal to prescribe for anxiety and sleep disorders despite this absence of empirical evidence for efficacy for this condition. Another possibility for the increase is that people are faking anxiety disorders to get prescribed cannabis for non-medical purposes. I know this is happening. I have friends and colleagues who do it. However, and I probably, if I was 25, I would probably do the same thing. So I'm not judging anybody for doing it. I'm just saying human beings tend to exploit loopholes, and this is one that I think is being exploited. It's also more likely, I think, and is also concerning because, one, it reduces the credibility of people who are genuinely seeking help for their anxiety disorders. It also makes it hard to accurately assess prevalence of use for certain conditions. So we'll go back to what's changed over the CAM surveys. A whole lot of people who were smoking it are now ingesting it more safely, so that's good. A whole lot of people who were self-prescribing illicit medical cannabis are now getting some exposure to advice from people with medical qualifications, and that's also good. What's concerning, though, is it seems to be evidenced in the last couple of years, especially, a lot more people are being prescribed cannabis to treat conditions for which there's very little evidence for efficacy, such as mental health and sleep disorders. And it seems to be that there's quite a few people who are basically obtaining cannabis under the pretense of a medical condition who are using it non-medically, which sort of is starting to get towards the pre-legalization model in California before they legalized it for recreational use. So what's changed between 2018 and 2020 to cause this big increase? Well, there was a pandemic, but the big increase in prescriptions started happening before the pandemic. And I think what is happening is the entrance of the cannabis clinics, the commercial sector into the medicinal cannabis space. Which brings us to a study that Nick has recently, that's basically under review at the moment, and it's about consumer experience of accessing medicinal cannabis from GPs versus people who obtain it from medicinal cannabis clinics. Now, medicinal cannabis clinics are there to basically streamline the process of obtaining a medical cannabis prescription, and they make it much faster and easier, and they charge money for performing that service. So what we did is we compared a bunch of different variables based on whether people say they mainly got their medical cannabis, their prescribed cannabis from a cannabis clinic or from the GP. People who got their medical cannabis from a cannabis clinic were more likely to be employed. They were less likely to be cannabis naive when they started treatment, so they were using cannabis non-medically when they started using it medically. They're more likely to endorse criteria consistent with both mild and moderate to severe cannabis use disorder. They're more likely to use for non-medical reasons as well as for medical reasons. And they're more likely to treat a mental health condition and less likely to treat a pain condition. And this is the big one here. Basically, we asked people whether their doctor, the people they got their medical cannabis from, were likely to treat other health issues. And of course, 50% of the people who were seeing a GP said yes, whereas only, I don't know what, 2 or 3% people in the cannabis clinic said yes. I'll summarise this table. Cannabis clinics are younger, they're healthier, they started using younger for medical reasons. They use more non-medical cannabis and they pay more. But they started using non-medically around the same time, and they consume cannabis both medically and non-medically with the same frequency. Now, this is a bit of a busy graph, but it's summarised over here. So participants getting medical cannabis from GPs tend to be more satisfied with their treatment overall than people going to cannabis clinics. We did an ordinal regression on this. So we said, what's the odds of people endorsing a higher category? And the odds, people across all these categories here tended to favour the general health clinic. And to summarise, people who are getting their medical cannabis from a general health setting tend to are more satisfied with the information they get about the harms of medical cannabis and also about the evidence for efficacy for the treatment for which they're seeking it. They're more satisfied with the amount of face time that they get with their prescriber, and especially with the fact that their GPs will consider alternatives, their prescribers will consider alternatives to medical cannabis to treat their conditions. However, it's very important to note that levels of satisfaction were very high across both groups of people, of respondents, except down the bottom for fees. Everyone's unhappy about how much it costs. Now, this is where it's worth discussing patient satisfaction. So satisfaction may not actually be the best metric for assessing quality of patient care in this case. If people get what they want, they're usually satisfied. But what they want is not always the same as what is good for them, although it is in many cases. So cannabis clinics have streamlined what was a very cumbersome process for accessing medical cannabis and have made it easier for people who benefit from cannabis medication to access it. It's led to people consuming their medical cannabis more safely and getting medical advice on how best to administer their medication. However, Olivia Dobson pointed out in this article here that it's actually quite unusual for a medical practice to be based around a single drug, or any drug, in fact. Most are based around a condition or a bodily symptom. For example, oncologists or OBGYN. There's no real anticoagulant clinics, for example. There's no opioid clinics. There's no benzo clinics. But medical cannabis appears to be the exception. And this unfortunately creates conditions that might lead to conflict of interest among the people who work there. There's an incentive for doctors working in these clinics to prescribe one drug and one drug only. So what's the answer? Do we just get rid of the clinics? Well, I would argue no. There's danger in assuming that cannabis helps no one with their mental health conditions. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, as you'll hear many pretentious Bayesians like me saying ad infinitum. Cannabis might help some people with their mental health and sleep conditions. The way we do research is we aggregate things, and that can often miss subtleties and can miss subgroups. 97% of all respondents in the CAM survey say it is effective at treating their condition, including mental health and sleep conditions. And this is despite there being no empirical evidence for efficacy for these conditions. Now, that is a big gap between evidence and anecdote. Are they all wrong? I think it seems unlikely that they are all wrong. However, there is a problem here, which is that if you ask someone how they know that cannabis helps with their mental health condition, with their anxiety, for example, then they might say, well, I know because when I stop taking cannabis, I feel anxious. Now, the issue is that one of the primary symptoms of withdrawal across all drugs is anxiety. Anxiety is a big withdrawal symptom. So they could actually just be treating their withdrawal, not their anxiety. The only real way to know if it's effective with anxiety is to treat people who've got anxiety disorders already and who've never used cannabis before. And they're very hard to do. And I haven't seen any studies that have done that. However, it is very important not to dismiss the patient's experience, as any doctor will tell you. But I still think the absence of evidence for efficacy for mental health conditions should still give doctors pause before prescribing cannabis to patients. And that's especially to patients they don't know well, who have a prior history of non-medical/recreational cannabis use, and who have not tried alternative medications that do have a strong evidence base. For example, benzodiazepines for anxiety or SSRIs for anxiety. We need basically, you'll hear researchers say this every single day of the week, we need much more research, especially into whom medical cannabis helps, whom it doesn't help, and why. And the why is something that applied research is really not great at asking. We tend to ask, does it work, rather than why does it work? There's also danger in assuming that all people are faking their disorders to get weed. It's almost certain that some are, maybe even many, but many are not. And there's also sort of labile boundaries between medical and non-medical use. In the case of mental health, for example, the demarcation between taking a drug to relax and taking a drug to reduce anxiety is very blurry. If you are relaxed, you tend not to be anxious. And I'm just going to come out and say it. I think we should just legalize non-medical cannabis use. It would solve so many problems, and especially it would clean up the medical cannabis research space and make things much clearer. So with regards to the gap between patient ratings of efficacy and evidence, doctors will say that you should trust the patient, but there's a reason doctors don't just turn their prescription pad over to the patients. Doctors are the ones who protect the patient. They protect them from charlatans, from mountebanks, and ultimately from themselves. And if you want to know the difference between a charlatan and a mountebank, a charlatan is someone who exploits the customer out of ignorance. A mountebank is someone who does it knowingly. So the doctors are there to interpret the evidence and to make judgments on what is good for the patients. They're the gateway to the drug, and they're the ones who are supposed to protect the patients ultimately from themselves and other people. So Reese works for a place that specialises in harm minimisation, and I'm sure he will burn my straw man to the ground at the end of this. But I'm going to try and have a go at the harm minimisation argument. So the argument goes like this. So irrespective of evidence for efficacy of medical cannabis, prescribing cannabis to people who would have used it to treat their medical conditions anyway is good, because one, it exposes them to medical advice and guidance, which means safer administration and safer dosing, less smoking, more vaping, more eating. And it means they'll use it in safer forms with fewer contaminants. However, I'd suggest that this is only true if doctors who are prescribing it do so in a responsible way. That is, they do a thorough medical history, they inquire whether patients have a prior history of non-medical use, and they pursue alternative medications or treatment first if those medications or treatments have better empirical evidence for efficacy. And that's the end of my talk, very early. I'll just point out here at the end that it's worth mentioning that a lot of the SASB data has been superseded by the Authorised Prescribed scheme. Many more people get their licenses, get their prescribed medical cannabis through this scheme. However, we don't use that data because it's much more opaque and no information about patient demographics and conditions is available. Anyway, thanks very much.
Can't hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, Sarah, not getting any audio through from you.
I'm getting it now. Oh, no, still can't hear you.
You want me to take over? Yeah. Look, thanks very much, Llew. Given Sarah's technical difficulties, are you going to have another go, Sarah? No. Okay. Llew, thanks for that fantastic presentation. Very thorough presentation and very broad and very thought-provoking. I think is the plan to take Rhys in as an initial commentator, and then we'll have a broader discussion after that. So, Rhys, could I let you introduce yourself and make comments? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Llew, for a great presentation. You preempted many of my critiques, unfortunately, Llew. As I was writing them down, you managed to address them. So I don't have any fuel to add to your straw man fire. But hi everybody, thanks for having me. My name's Rhys Cohen. I'm the policy officer at Pennington Institute, and as Sarah introduced me earlier, I've been around in the medical cannabis space in Australia for some time. Pennington Institute, the organisation where I work, we also believe that it would be appropriate and sensible to regulate access to cannabis for adults to use for non-medical purposes, for many of the reasons that you've illustrated here, Llew. And one thing in particular that comes to my mind was at the end of your presentation when you were saying that, in theory, allowing people who were going to access cannabis anyway to get it through a healthcare professional has a lot of obvious benefits. They might receive, information and education and support about managing their health issues and whatnot. But as you so correctly point out, Llew, that's not necessarily always the case. And I think, unfortunately, sadly, overwhelmingly, it is often not the case for many of these people. And it's a bit of a tragedy, but I'm increasingly of the opinion that a properly, tightly regulated market for adults to access cannabis for non-medical purposes from a retail store, for example, could be structured in such a way as to ensure people get more education and better support than they're currently getting through many of the medical cannabis clinics that are servicing the community. Yeah, that's just my initial thoughts. I'll leave it over to you, Michael and Llew.
Okay, thanks very much. And there are a number of questions, and I'll run through in a minute. But first of all, probably to address with you, Llew, that you really haven't gone into anything about some of the issues about the balance between CBD and THC and where that might fall in relation to both harms, risk, and marketing around medicinal and other types of cannabis. Do you want to make any comment on that? Probably Llew first, but also Rhys.
Look, Rhys knows more about this stuff than me in almost every facet, but I don't know. I think CBD is still, its efficacy is still firmly yet to be proven for anything. So, except maybe childhood epilepsy. I think that's the one condition that's extremely rare. So, I'm not sure that's a big issue. But what do you think, Rhys?
I mean, I'm not a clinician or a health researcher, but I'm also yet to be convinced that the common belief and the hope is that including CBD alongside THC might help ameliorate some of the more harmful effects of THC. And there's some research that suggests that might be possible. There's other research that shows no such effect. In particular, like there's been some recent research by Tom Arkell and colleagues into driving impairment or effects of cannabis on driving performance. And in some of their analysis, they found that actually the adding CBD to THC in some of their participants increased the impairing effects of the cannabis that they were taking. So once again, it's about dose, condition. There are so many variables that we haven't nailed down. But one thing I will say is that if CBD is safer, if cannabis is safer when CBD is included in the cannabis product that's being consumed, Australians are extremely unlikely to be getting any CBD from illicit cannabis that might be available to them. And this, so in that regard, whatever else is going on with the medical cannabis framework, at the very least, more people are actually getting access to CBD, and more products do include CBD in them.
Yeah. So just another query in a sense, as a just broad concept, and this is for both of you, and you may say, well, you're not clinicians, so you don't want to, but it is the notion of, traditionally the notion of having a medication for anxiety disorders. Most of the medications that we have invented for anxiety disorders have resulted in the medium to longer term in more problems than they've actually solved. Why will we not be doing the same thing with cannabis as we've done with the other ones? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, it's entirely possible that we might end up doing that if rates of cannabis use overall in the community increase. What's been interesting is that alongside the massive increase in access to prescribed medical cannabis products in Australia, we haven't really seen any significant increases in overall recent use in the Australian community. I know there's been an increase in more daily use in some of the more recent survey data, but yeah, simply providing access for people who would already be accessing cannabis illicitly isn't going to necessarily move that needle, is what I would say.
Llew, any thoughts?
Yeah, do you think that what you said is true of SSRIs, that the problems outweigh the benefits?
I don't think SSRIs.
Benzos, I would agree, but
yeah.
SSRIs probably not.
Yeah, I don't think they're primarily used for anxiety disorders, though.
No, they prescribe them for anxiety all the time. I mean, GPs do.
As part of an antidepressant effect, really.
Yes, but it has knock-on effects with anxiety.
Okay, there's just a few questions here from and I'll just read them out, and you can see who wants to deal with them. First of all, Louise Carmen says, harm minimization. I've heard concerns raised about the increased strength of medical cannabis versus homegrown, e.g. versus strong pharmaceutical grade compared to lower strengths. What are your thoughts on that?
This is definitely in Reese's ballpark, I think.
Happy to feel that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's, once again, caveat, not a healthcare professional or whatnot, but I think it's pretty, I'd be comfortable saying that higher strength cannabis is probably more risky and harmful than lower strength cannabis. And it's also absolutely the case that prescribed medical cannabis products in Australia today are much more potent than illicit cannabis is likely to be. And that is concerning.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And Priyanka, who I think is the reporter on the on the health report ABC, asks, is medicinal cannabis addictive?
Yes. I mean, all things that make you feel good are addictive, aren't they? If you're a human being, and cannabis is definitely addictive. If medical cannabis has got THC in it, it's just as addictive as THC in non-medical cannabis. Wouldn't you agree, Reese?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Like you say, all substances are addictive, all drugs are addictive. I think rates of cannabis use disorder among people who use cannabis are estimated to be somewhere between sort of 10 to 15%. Michael, you probably know this better than I do, so please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think it's around that. Yeah, I thought
which is,
that's what I. Yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, which is I'm sort of straying into a domain that I'm not familiar with, but I think that's a roughly similar rate to other, like alcohol, for example, or other commonly used drugs. So it is addictive. Cannabis in general is addictive, but I don't think it's any more addictive than any other drugs of concern that we might be worried about.
And there's plenty of medicines that aren't cannabis that are also addictive, like opioids being the classic example, but benzodiazepines as well. So just because it's addictive doesn't mean you shouldn't prescribe it if it does what it's supposed to do well. However, you have to manage the back end carefully.
Okay. Now, Llew, here's a question for you from Andrew McDonnell. A lot of prescribers will only renew a script that is consistently adhered to. If you have a few weeks off, they won't renew if they start again. This poses a threat to harm minimization. Any thoughts from you on this?
I'm not sure I followed the reasoning so clearly. Reese, did you?
I think he's saying basically you get, if you're not completely adherent, you'll get knocked off your prescription. That's not going to be helpful. I think that's the point.
I mean, I've not heard of that happening very often when it comes to medical cannabis. In fact, unfortunately, the opposite is more often true, that people get prescribed more than they need or should be prescribed. And especially with some of the more contentious business models, which are based on a subscription model, people will continue receiving a certain volume of cannabis every month, just on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. On a direct debit.
God.
Yeah. Now here's one which I think you sort of you dealt with a bit earlier, Llew, but I'll just raise it. Janelle Rooney asks, what's the evidence for the efficacy of cannabis use for pain management?
Better than anxiety for certain chronic pain conditions. It's not marvelous, but it's definitely better. You're on more solid ground if you're prescribing it for that. It's just we're not. I mean, all this research is still kind of in its infancy a little bit, so we're not quite sure the mechanism of action. Or if it works because it distracts people and makes them feel good, rather than reducing inflammation or reducing prostaglandins and some of the stuff that the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories do for pain. So we're not sure of the mechanism of action, but it does seem to be more effective.
Yeah. So a question from Isabella Goodwin is, thanks for the talk. Just wondering what safe dosage guidelines are provided to client patients when receiving medical cannabis prescriptions, and whether this is standardized information across GPs and commercial clinics. I think the answer to that is no, but I'll leave either of you talk about that.
I don't. I have to confess ignorance on this one. Reese, do you know?
Because there's only, as Llew said, there's only 2 registered cannabis medicines in Australia. So as far as dosing guidelines and precise, dosing instructions and whatnot that's been validated and approved, those are the only 2 drugs. So overwhelmingly, these are unregistered medicines with no, with no. However, companies do include, consumer medicine information booklets that, and provide education and guidance to prescribers on what might be appropriate. But at the end of the day, it's down to the individual prescriber. Yeah.
Okay. And here's another question, which is, what's the average difference in cost between medical and non-medical cannabis? Also, while prescriptions are being provided, how many of these are filled? I'm not sure what that is. Also, are prescriptions sought for other reasons, i.e. driving? Well, I think that means...
So maybe in reverse order. So having a medical cannabis prescription does not protect you from driving law infringements to do with the presence of THC, except in the state of Tasmania under certain conditions. And now I've forgotten the other 2 questions. Sorry.
Can you repeat them, Mike?
Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, it's what's the average difference in cost between medical and non-medical cannabis?
Well, Lou, your CAM survey has some interesting data in that.
Yeah, look, I don't have it off the top of my head. A fair bit. Everyone seems to be upset about it. Yes, I'm not sure. The cost stuff is quite difficult to get access to, isn't it? I mean, we talked about this, I think last year, maybe sometime, Reese. I kind of sent you an email asking if you knew where to find out if the cost of cannabis, prescribed cannabis has gone down over as more players have entered the market. But it still seems to be staying pretty stubbornly high.
I think it depends on, so it can be much cheaper, would be my opinion. There are some products on the market, the prescribed medical cannabis product on the market at the moment, that are both stronger, higher quality, and much cheaper than illicit cannabis is on average. However, those would be a dozen or so products out of literally 1,000 that could conceivably be prescribed. Okay. And so depending on who you see and XYZ, you have to have a bit of nous to sort of figure out how to access the more affordable products, because it's often not in the interests of the clinics to prescribe affordable products to patients, because they have direct commercial conflicts of interests in these in selling these products to patients.
Right. So now this is for you, Llew. It's from Michael Swartz. It says, wondering why so much emphasis was put on the 97% who are satisfied with their use. Surely this is misleading. Of course, they consider themselves to benefit, or they would stop. The population who do not benefit were not captured. It's like asking a basketballer whether basketball is fun. I'm just quoting the question.
Oh yeah, 100%. It's a self-selected sample. We make no, we're not trying to conceal that at all. I agree. I would love to speak to some people who are dissatisfied with it. I think some people, when they answer the CAM's questions, see it as a bit of a political statement. It's like a bit of a soapbox. So you've got to take all this stuff with a grain of salt, really. I mean, I'm not saying there's no insights to be had from it, but you've got to just be careful.
Here's the one that you referred to earlier, Reese, Llew, but I'll raise it. It says, I would like to hear the panel's thoughts on tightening regulation of medicinal cannabis versus legalizing non-medical cannabis in terms of potential public health harms, i.e. increased rates of psychosis, cannabis use disorders. Would option be better than the other? I mean, you made a comment on that in your presentation, Llew. Do you want to expand on that? And then I'll go to Reese. Yeah,
this is a massive rabbit hole of a question, this one. Legalizing it for non-medical use. In America, what happened, I've seen figures where it said that it doesn't increase the number of people who smoke frequently, but for the people who were smoking frequently, it increased the amount that they used, and therefore it increased rates of cannabis use disorder. So allowing access, so legalizing non-medical cannabis use may result in increased rates of cannabis use disorder among the people who would be smoking anyway. However, you have to balance that out against the cost of having recreational cannabis be illegal. And that's always something that you have to take into consideration. There's going to be harms, there's going to be costs no matter what you do. You just have to decide how you weigh the implications of those costs.
Reese, would you like to make a comment?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd broadly agree with that, Llew. I mean, 70,000 Australians roughly every year are arrested for possession of cannabis or use of small amounts of cannabis. The various estimates that have been produced, including figures that we cite in some of our reports, that upwards of $2 billion per year might be currently expended in Australia maintaining the illegality of cannabis. So there's that whole other side of this equation that needs to be considered. But also I would say, will cannabis legalization increase harms? It depends how you do it. And one of the benefits, I think, and I hope of legalizing cannabis in Australia is that we would not need to do it within the pre-existing context of a complex pharmaceutical and medicines regulatory framework, which is, I think, one of the reasons why we've ended up with so many of the issues with medical cannabis that we're seeing today, is we've got, you know, laws and regulations and fragmented regulatory bodies that have been evolving over decades to manage healthcare in a particular way, and cannabis, you know, manages to fit through the cracks. But if you start from a blank sheet of paper, so to speak, and you design a framework in consultation with the community and experts that's intended to not increase harms from using cannabis, or even possibly reduce harms, then that could be beneficial.
So is the current situation in practice de facto legalization?
I think it's de facto legalization for the wealthy and educated.
Yeah, that's very well said.
While maintaining criminalization and punishment for less educated, less well-off, more rural, more indigenous people. It's a stark sort of class contrast, I think.
Yeah. I'm so glad you came on, Reese.
But so I suppose the question then is, what sorts of, if you were looking at the current setup and you were tweaking the current setup, what would be the key changes you would recommend in the current arrangements to improve it?
My number one, which is a bit of a wonky one, is to prohibit direct commercial conflicts of interest when it comes to cannabis clinics. It should not be permitted. It shouldn't be possible for a clinic that employs a doctor to also own its own brand of medical cannabis products that the doctors that they employ prescribe and dispense through a pharmacy also owned by the same corporation. To me, that is one of the key distorting effects in the commercial sector that's I think generating a lot of these harms, and it's not appropriate, and it should be removed.
And telehealth, I mean, a lot of anecdotally, people have told me that they go on and they can get their prescription for anxiety with a 5-minute telehealth consultation. Now, there's no way in a 5-minute telehealth consultation anyone's doing any kind of detailed patient history or any of the stuff that I talked about. Asking them, you know, are you using cannabis non-medically? All these sorts of questions that are, you know, you have to try and protect the patient against from themselves in a way.
Okay. So, question here from these questions jump around the place just as I've got it. It runs off on itself, but here I'll have another go at finding it.
While you're doing that, I'll just say, Llew, I think, and I agree, I think one of the reasons that is so common, these 5-minute telehealth consults with inappropriate quality medical care, is because the companies providing that service are actually not making any profit from the medical consultations themselves. That's not where their profit is derived. It's a way to get more people through the door so that they can enter them into their closed loop prescribing model, and they make a profit off the product sales. So it's all tied up.
So Jan Munford asks the question, workplace drug testing has found issues that those with prescribed cannabis claiming medical needs, but when a blood test is done, they're over the expected prescribed blood levels. This has resulted in nil tolerance for positive drug tests. Have you heard of any cases where an appeal was successful, or data on employment and cannabis medicine and legislation? So it's something to do with the impact of this in the workplace testing, I suppose, issues around that.
There was an upper house, a Victorian upper house inquiry into this issue last year. And if you're interested, there were several submissions made by different unions, and I believe they included case studies of people who'd experienced this problem in their workplace. I'm unsure if any of them were examples of successfully challenging that ruling, but it's fraught because, at least in Victoria, the state where I'm in, workplace drug policy is up to individual companies by and large. So some might take a zero tolerance approach, others may be more reasonable or flexible depending on the circumstances. But unless they're in violation of the Charter for Human Rights or any other relevant piece of legislation, it's sort of carte blanche.
Okay, and here's a question from Rajan Lalar. And it says, it makes so much sense working with young people at origin and cannabis-induced psychosis and anxiety. Many people present with prescribed cannabis and the assessment gets done virtually. The only concern I have encountered is that most of the clinics prescribe cannabis where a young person could be concealing their mental health illness during an assessment. How much these clinics do look into gathering the history and collateral information from other services and families of consumer. How comprehensive is the assessment when people are getting prescribed? I mean, you've dealt with that already, Llew, in relation to saying that an awful lot of the big clinics, the online clinics, are very cursory.
Well, I don't see how it could be anything other than cursory with a 5-minute telehealth interview, really. I mean, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that they're all bad or they all do it badly or that all the doctors in these clinics do it badly. But there certainly seems to be, as Reese has pointed out, a big conflict of interest here.
So the question from Will Doran is, do you think other states will look into the issue of driving if there's no clear way to say how long THC may be present when roadside tested? Any thoughts on that?
It's a live issue. I mean, it always has been, but it's not going away anytime soon, this problem. We've had some modest law reforms in Victoria last year that allowed magistrates to use their discretion as to whether to restrict someone's license if they're a medical cannabis patient and they were tested positive for the presence of THC and there were no other sort of confounding factors. That's a step in the right direction. There's talk in New South Wales about this issue being looked at by governments, but it's a really challenging one because there is no way to test for THC impairment at the roadside, and that technology is not imminent. So in the absence of an accurate impairment test, I think it's a real challenge. It's both a technical challenge and a policy challenge and a political challenge. Yeah.
Now, Narda Arndt asks, in the forensic space, we're starting to see significant numbers of clients with long-term polysubstance use dependence and complex mental health histories, inclusive of psychosis, obtaining prescriptions of cannabis via online prescribers or often interstate. Has there been any consideration for better regulation and communication between prescribers and face-to-face GPs?
Lots of discussions and people voicing concerns, but no substantive steps taken yet to my knowledge. And those sorts of examples are really, quite concerning. Obviously, I think one of the other challenges with addressing this issue in particular is we have very little public data about how many people with those conditions, for example, have started getting access to prescribed medical cannabis when they previously were not accessing illicit cannabis. Until we know the true extent of that, I think it's hard to get a grasp of where the problems are and what to do about them.
Yeah, well, listen, I think we've come to the end of the time, but I'd like to thank both of you for a very open discussion on what is obviously a complex and moving topic with a lot of very loose edges to it, which I think is coming up in the public debate forum. And I know that I've heard that APRA and different people are focusing a bit of attention on this. And I do think some of the issues also have implications for other types of medication like ketamine and psilocybin and that in relation to the prescribing and marketing issues around it. So I'm sure it's a topic we will come back to again, but I think it's been a very, very informative thing. So I'd like to thank you both. And just, Sarah, did you want to say, we'd usually announce what's happening next, but I'm afraid I'm not across that. So there's a little, here we are, it's coming up. So we will, on the 19th of June, epidemiology and management of invasive infections in people who inject drugs with Lucy Atwood from Monash. And also to note that on the 26th of September, we will have the annual symposium and people can register here, and it's free to register and free to attend. So thanks everybody, and I'd like to thank all the audience and all the people who've put in questions, and we've tried to pick a fair spread of them, but there was an awful lot of questions, so I'm sorry we couldn't cover them all. And also to say that this presentation will be available online afterwards if people want to look over it again and see the slides. And I'm sure Llew is happy to send information to people if they want to have it. So thank you very much, and bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks, Reece.